Hi, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here. I'm just give you a little bit of background so you know why a journalist is talking to you about things like obesity and weight regulation, not a doctor or nutritionist. So I was a journalist with a science background, actually a physics background, and my specialty was controversial science, good science and bad science, sort of how easy it is in science to get the wrong answer. Because I grew up in the physics community, I had a lot of friends in physics who, after my second book, said to me, if you're really fascinated with bad science, you should look at some of this stuff in public health. So in the early 90s, I moved into public health, and I kind of meandered through the field until around 1999. I spent a year researching this idea that the salt in our diet is the cause of hypertension and high blood pressure. And while I was doing that story, one of the worst scientists I'd ever interviewed, and I interviewed what I like to think are some of the worst scientists in the world, easily one of the 5 worst, took credit not just for getting Americans to eat less salt, but for getting us to eat less fat and less eggs, and in effect putting the whole country on this low-fat diet that Lance was talking about. And I literally put the phone down after the interview when I called up my editor at the journal Science, and I said, when I'm done with this salt story, I'm going to write about the whole low-fat thing, because one of the worst scientists I ever interviewed just took credit. I had no preconceptions whatsoever. The only thing I knew was that bad scientists never got the right answer. So my theory was that if this guy was really involved in any substantive way, there was a good story there. And I spent a year on the dietary fat story, coming to many of the conclusions that Lance discussed today. And then I pitched a story to the New York Times Magazine on what caused the obesity epidemic. This was 2001, back when it was relatively new. And I had a couple theories, and I spent about 6-8 months on that article, and it came out. It was a cover of the New York Times Magazine. Some of you might remember it was a porterhouse steak with a pat of butter on it, and the cover said, "What if fat doesn't make you fat?" And it was massively controversial. And as such massively controversial stories do, it got me a large book advance. So people accused me, even my friends accused me of writing the story and coming to controversial arguments just to get a large book advance. But I finally had enough money to do the research and spend the time that I wanted to really get into this subject of nutrition and health in depth, because I knew it was rife with terrible science. And so the end result, 5 years later, the advance lasted 4 years, by the way. 5 years later, and once again back in debt, I published Good Calories, Bad Calories. And it's 500 some odd pages. It's got about 160 pages of endnotes and bibliography. It's a dense revisionist science and history of nutrition and obesity. It might even be unreadable, depending on your perspective. So after I wrote Good Calories, Bad Calories, those people who could get through it, a lot of them sent me emails and wrote me and said, look, this book changed my life. Could you now please read one that, my husband could read, or my children could read, or my father could read, or my doctor could read? I even got emails from doctors saying, could you please write one that my patients might actually read? And so I ended up writing Why We Get Fat, which is sort of the airplane reading version and the argumentative version of it. So it condenses down the argument. And Why We Get Fat is based on this lecture, which I first gave at the University of California, Berkeley in November 2007. The great thing about this book is I now get emails from people who say, this book changed my life and my doctor gave it to me. So I know that I'm making progress, which is a good thing, because that was unheard of a decade ago when I started this research, aside from the fact that the book didn't exist. So with that as background, let me just ask a few questions. How many of you weigh more than your doctors would think are healthy? Okay. How many of you eat what you think is a healthy diet? It's pretty much consistent, except for the fellow back in the hat, who knows he doesn't. How many of you are mystified by this combination? And sort of why it is that you keep getting heavier and you've got lean friends who don't, or even lean siblings who don't? Do you find this at all confusing or, kind of perplexing, like how this happened to you? So this is what I want to talk about today. This is what I want to address. The context is we have this obesity epidemic. So Obesity rates, the number of obese, obese Americans has gone up dramatically since the early 70s. It's gone along with the diabetes epidemic, which is actually a little more frightening because diabetes is a very serious chronic condition, and diabetes rates have increased fivefold since the early 70s. And the subtext of all this is that, and I could have given a lecture on any one of these disease states, but as you get fatter, it goes along with a host of chronic diseases. So stroke, heart disease, gallbladder disease, diabetes, hypertension, neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's is associated with increased weight, increased diabetes, fatty liver disease, osteoarthritis, cancer. And the conventional wisdom is as you get fatter, something about the state of being fat, maybe the toxic inflammatory molecules that your fat tissue produces cause these other diseases or increase the risk. But the argument that I make in my books and the argument that I would just want you to keep in mind is that maybe the same thing that makes you fat also causes these diseases. So it's not like you get fat and that's what increases the risk, but whatever it is that makes you fat is what also increases the risk of all these other diseases. So start with a quote from Robert Burton. It said, "It's vain to speak of cures or think of remedies until such time as we have considered of the causes. Cures must be imperfect, lame, and to no purpose, when the causes have not first been searched." So what we fundamentally want to know is, what is it that makes us fat? What's the cause of obesity? Okay, and the World Health Organization gives us the conventional wisdom. Fundamental cause is an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended. In the scientific literature, this is referred to as you'll see this sentence: obesity is an energy balance disorder. If you go into positive energy balance, you get fatter. If you go into negative energy balance, and where you're expending more than you're taking in, you get thinner. So here's the hypothesis as it's sort of described today. So too much food, too little physical activity causes overeating, okay? You've got more energy coming in than going out, and the end result is obesity and the obesity epidemic. And the way this relates to the obesity epidemic is that we just have too much food available. And we have too much motive. We don't have enough opportunity to be physically active. So there's fast food joints on every corner. There's convenience stores or all this tasty, energy-dense food, and we can't say no to it. As this fellow Kelly Brownell said, like cheeseburgers and French fries are as much a factor of our environment now as trees and clouds. And then we have no motivation to be physically active because we have TVs and movies and iPads and computers, and our kids don't go outside to play. My kids don't go outside to play. I moved them from New York to California so they would use the yard, and it hasn't worked, okay? Just wanted to get that out of the way. I've been dwelling on that. Anyway, how many people believe this idea that you get fat because you take in more calories than you expend? Okay, reasonable percentage. Let's say 40% admit it and 41%. Okay. So that's what we're going to address. That is a hypothesis, might be true, but it's, one of the things they teach in science that you can question any hypothesis. Maybe you should question any hypothesis. And one of the first things you do when you question a hypothesis, you look for counterexamples, okay? So one of the things I did in my research, I went through the literature, and I got a little mad doing this, by the way, because the medical research community should have done this and shouldn't have left it up to this journalist. But I went through the literature looking for examples of populations with high levels of obesity without this toxic environment that we live in, these fast food joints and convenience stores and computers and iPads. And I came up with about a dozen of them, pre-1982. That's when I stopped. And they're fascinating when you look at what you can learn from them. So the first one up here in red is Sioux of the South Dakota Crow Creek Reservation. This is a study done by two University of Chicago economists in 1928. Okay? At the time, 1927, the U.S. government had done a study on the conditions on Indian reservations, and they said they were so poor, the poverty was so intense, it was impossible for Americans of 1927 to imagine it. So you can imagine today how much more impossible it would be for us. And then these economists go to this Crow Creek Reservation, that should be 1928, the year after, and they realize that these people are living in 1 to 2 room shacks, 4 to 8 people per room. They have no plumbing, they get government rations supplied once a month to feed them. And yet 40% of the women, 10% of the men, and a quarter of the children were distinctly fat. And 20% of the women, 25% of the men and children were extremely thin. So you had this combination of obesity and malnutrition coexisting in the same population. In fact, everyone in the tribe had signs of deficiency diseases, vitamin deficiencies, protein deficiencies. The children were stunted, and yet you had high levels of obesity. If you go down to the second one down in red, Trinidad, in the early 60s, they're having a malnutrition crisis. The island is rife with these deficiency diseases. The U.S. government sends a team of nutritionists down to help. And they come back and they say they were amazed a third of the women over 25 are obese. And obesity is a potentially serious medical problem in women. And the next year, an MIT nutritionist goes down to study the diets and try to understand this. And she reports that the per capita daily diet was less than 2,000 calories a day, 21% fat, fewer calories than were recommended by the Food and Agriculture Organization at the time as necessary for a healthy diet. Okay, so it's hard to imagine that these women were overeating, that there was no convenience stores, there just wasn't enough food available, and yet somehow they had managed to become obese. 64, 65, Bantu pensioners in South Africa. This is the poorest of a disenfranchised black population pre-apartheid in South Africa, and the mean weight of women over 60 was 165 pounds. 30% of the women were severely overweight. Chilean factory workers in 74, second from the bottom, 30% were obese, 10% were undernourished. Okay, these are people working on construction lines. Most were engaged in heavy labor, and nearly 50% of the women over 54 were obese. But here again, we have that combination of obesity and undernutrition, not enough food in the same population, and it's a very hard-working population. They don't belong to gyms or health clubs. They're not, going for power walks for 45 minutes every day. They're working at a construction line in Chilean factories, so they're more physically active than we are. I did manual labor for 3 weeks, I think senior year after high school on some road gang, and I give these women all the credit in the world because I could never do that, okay? And yet, they're obese anyway. 1981, Mexican Americans in Starr County, Texas, 50% of the women in their 50s are obese, 40% of the men in their 40s. Starr County is on the border of Mexico. It's about 200 miles due south of San Antonio. This was a study done by a cardiologist at the University of Texas Southwestern. So you have these high levels of obesity. What's interesting, it's the United States, even though it's Mexican American, so they had their high school yearbooks, and all these people were lean in high school, and their kids were lean, and they were working. They were employed in agricultural labor and or work in the oil fields in the country, so they are hard-working, poor people. There was one restaurant in Starr County, Texas in 1981. It was a Mexican restaurant. And the point is, there are none of these signs of the toxic environment as described today in the literature, the fast food joints, et cetera. And yet you've got these high levels of obesity. So the question is pretty simple. Why were these populations fat? Because if we can figure out why they were fat, this is Occam's razor in science. Find the simplest possible hypothesis. If we could figure out why they were fat, we could probably figure out why we're fat. And we could probably rule out sedentary behavior because we had these incredibly physically active populations, the construction workers, the oil field laborers. And if we wanted to, we could probably rule out, fast food joints and convenience stores and the toxic food environment because some of these people were starving. So if you look at it, here's how this question was phrased in 1973. Okay, Ralph Richards was a British-trained diabetes specialist who in the early 60s went to Jamaica and opened a diabetes clinic at the University of the West Indies. And in 73, he reported that 60% of the adult women in Jamaica were obese. And at that conference where he reported, he said it's difficult to explain the high frequency of obesity seen in a relatively impecunious society. It's a relatively poor society such as exists in the West Indies when compared to the standard of living enjoyed in the more developed countries. So he's puzzled by the same problem. We would think that obesity would be a problem in rich countries because they're the ones who could eat as much as they want and don't have to work for a living. Why is it a problem in poor countries like this? Malnutrition and subnutrition are common disorders in the first 2 years of life. Subnutrition continues in early childhood to the early teens. By subnutrition, it means they're not getting enough food, enough calories. Okay? Obesity begins to manifest itself in the female population from the 25th year of life and reaches enormous proportions from 30 onwards. So here's the same question Same issue addressed 30 years later by Benjamin Caballero, who's a director of the Laboratory for Human Nutrition at Johns Hopkins. And this was an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a pretty good journal. And Caballero says, and now, after 35 years, this idea that obesity is an energy balance disorder is kind of set in like ice on a stone. Okay, so now it's dogma. It's what we all believe. And Caballero says, a few years ago, I was visiting a primary care clinic in the slums of Sao Paulo, Brazil. The waiting room was full of mothers with thin, stunted young children exhibiting the typical signs of chronic undernutrition. Their appearance, sadly, would surprise few who visit poor urban areas in the developing world, but might come as a surprise that many of the mothers holding those undernourished infants were themselves overweight. And then he says the coexistence of underweight and overweight poses a challenge to public health programs, since the aims of programs to reduce undernutrition, which is make more food available, right, are obviously in conflict with those for obesity prevention, which is make people eat less food. Okay? And I put this poses a challenge to public health programs in bold italics, because this coexistence of underweight and overweight in the same populations and even the same families, these obese mothers with thin, stunted children, doesn't pose a challenge to your public health programs. It poses a challenge to your paradigm, your belief system. Okay, if you believe that people got obese, these mothers got obese by merely taking in more calories than they expended, okay, eating superfluous calories that they don't need, that their bodies don't need, then you believe that these mothers were eating those calories that they could have given to their starving children to keep them alive. You could think of it as their kids are starving and they're sneaking outside to eat a Snickers bar, okay? So the question would be, how many of you are mothers? How many of you would let your kids starve so you could eat extra calories that you don't need? Okay. Okay. The point. We've got a paradigm of maternal behavior, right? Mothers will starve to death before they'll let their children starve. And we have a paradigm of obesity that you get fat because you take in extra calories you don't need. And those two paradigms can't coexist in these populations. Because if you believe the obesity paradigm, you have to throw out the maternal behavior paradigm. And if you throw out the maternal behavior paradigm, if you believe that, you have to throw out the obesity paradigm. Because I had a mother, I am going to throw out the obesity paradigm by the time we're done with this conference. One of the interesting things about this, just in science, one of the things you want to find in science, that the thing you want to find in science is the anomalous observation, the observation that cannot be explained by your theory. Because if you can find that, you have something on which to build a better theory, which is the goal, a better observation, a better explanation. And they've been sitting on this observation in nutrition obesity research for 90-odd years at least, and nobody cares. They see it as a problem with public health programs. How do we deal with it? So let's look at some more reasons to question the energy balance hypothesis. Eating less doesn't work. That's one reason. If we get fat because we eat too much, we should be able to just rein back. And it's true that if you starve people, they will lose weight. But as soon as you're done starving them, they will gain it back. Okay, if you actually do randomized controlled trials experiments where you put people on this group on a calorie-restricted diet, a semi-starvation diet as used to be known, and this group gets to eat normal, what you find are the results is the Cochrane collaboration, which is an international group put together to do unbiased reviews of the literature. The results are so small as to be clinically insignificant. Okay, it just doesn't work. We've known it doesn't work, arguably since the 1940s, if not before. And Hilda Brooke, you can ask, should it work? Should we be surprised by this, okay? And Hilda Brooke, who was a leading expert, leading authority on childhood obesity in the mid-20th century, put it this way, okay? She said, more than in any other illness, the physician treating the obese patient is called upon only to do a special trick, to make the patient do something, stop eating after it has already been proved that he cannot do it. Okay, we all know we're supposed to eat less. They knew it 50 years ago, they knew it 100 years ago, 150 years ago. If you're fat, you're supposed to eat less. If you're still fat, eating less hasn't worked. Maybe you don't have willpower. We don't know why it hasn't worked. But having a doctor or a researcher tell you to eat less, and then that's supposed to work, and then it fails, shouldn't be a surprise. Okay, the other problem is exercising more doesn't work. So we got this energy balance thing. We're either supposed to eat less and or exercise more. And I could show you meta-analyses, systematic reviews of the data from eating, exercising more. My favorite was a Scandinavian study in 1989 in which they took 18 couch potatoes and trained them to run marathons. And over the course of 18 months, they got to the point where they ran a marathon, and the men lost 5 pounds of body fat, and the 9 women had 0% change in body composition. Having gone from running marathon, from being couch potatoes to actually running 3 miles. But here's how the American Heart Association, the American College of Sports Medicine put it in 2007. This were joint physical activity guidelines by 2 organizations that believe that being physically active is a critically important aspect of a healthy lifestyle, as I believe. And they were be expected to spin the evidence in favor of being physically active. But this is what they said. I was amazed when I saw this. They said it's reasonable to assume that persons with relatively high daily energy expenditures would be less likely to gain weight over time compared with those who have low energy expenditures. So that's the equivalent of saying it's reasonable to assume that you would be less likely to gain weight if you go from being a couch potato to a marathon runner than if you remain a couch potato. And then they said, so far, data to support this hypothesis are not particularly compelling. And what makes it so interesting is the hypothesis is about 150 years old, at least. And so it doesn't mean it's wrong. Maybe it's right. Maybe they just didn't do the studies right. They didn't do the right kind of increase in energy expenditure. But the point of this is that if you have a hypothesis, an idea, a belief that's 150 years old, and the best you can say about it is that the data aren't to support it or not particularly compelling, you might seriously consider the possibility that it's just wrong, or that it's based on some underlying belief that's just wrong. This is a bad sign. Okay, so let's go on and look at some other more bad signs. How many of you try to balance calories or count calories? How many of you have ever tried that in your life? Okay, let me tell you what that entails, because it's never done. And I first saw this calculation done in a 1937 textbook written by the leading authority on nutrition metabolism in the United States in the 1930s. And he did this calculation for the same reason I'm going to give it to you. So a typical adult's food intake is around 2,700 calories a day. That's average men and women. That's about 1 million calories a year. It's about 10 million calories in a decade, okay? About 10, 12 tons of food. So you ask the question, how accurately do I have to match calories in to calories out so they don't gain any more than, well, it should be 20 pounds over the course of a decade. Sorry, this is a talk I last gave in Europe, so you get it in kilograms. 10 kilograms over the course of a decade, okay? And the answer is 21 calories a day. If you stick 21 calories a day in your fat tissue that you don't burn, okay, you will gain 20 pounds in a decade, 40 pounds in 20 years. You're going to be from being, say, lean in your 20s to obese in your 40s, just like everyone does. Most of us do. Okay? And here's the calculation. It's really simple. 20 calories times 365 days in a year times 10 years, a decade, divided by 3,500 calories per pound of fat. There's about 3,500 calories in a pound of fat, and you come out with 21 pounds in a decade. Okay? It's 0.8% accuracy. You have to match calories in to calories out with 0.8% accuracy. If you overshoot, I said if you eat 100 bites of food a day and they're each 20 calories, which is about what they are, and you burn off 99 of them on average, and the 100th ends up in your fat tissue, you will become obese. And the reason Eugene Dubois, the leading authority on metabolism, did this calculation in his 1936 textbook is to make this point. This is impossible. Nobody can do this. Okay? Nobody can balance calories in to calories out like that. If this is how we maintain our weight, why aren't we all obese? Half of us should be obese and maybe the other half should be emaciated, right? Because it works both ways. And Dubois said there's no stranger phenomenon than the maintenance of a constant body weight under marked variation in bodily activity and food consumption. Something else has to be going on. And you could imagine, you could think, well, maybe what we do is, we overshoot for years, and then we realize we're getting fatter for whatever reason. We look in the mirror, our clothes don't fit, something happens, and then we undershoot. And so we oscillate around perfect energy balance, which is possible. But then the question is, how do animals do it? Because how do they realize they're getting fatter? They don't have mirrors to look into. They don't have husbands who make catty comments. How do they do it? And so you could go through each possibility, and the explanation is hard to believe. It stretches belief. So let's look at some other things. And now I have to apologize. I'm going to show photos of naked human beings. You don't get photos of obese or naked human beings in obesity textbooks anymore. On occasion, you get photos of obese rats. Pre-World War II, people used to show in the textbooks included photos of case studies because they thought you could learn a lot about looking at not just whether or not someone's obese or not, which is what we worry about, but how they get obese and where they get obese and when they get obese. And what I'm going to be doing now is channeling the pre-World War II researchers on how they thought of obesity. And one of the things I learned doing my research that I never thought of before, even though there was a reason that I should have. Prior to World War II, the lingua franca of science was German. Okay, if you wanted to do serious science in any field, you had to read German and ideally speak it, and you would go to Europe and study with the German clinicians or the Austrian clinicians, and that's how you would learn how to do science. And the best medical research in the world was done in Germany and Austria, and then the war came, and this all evaporated. And post-war, the research societies, research communities were rebuilt in the United States, often in some cases like physics, on the genius of these European emigres. When I wrote about physics in the mid-'80s, I was told that the best thing that ever happened to American science was Hitler, because he drove all these brilliant Europeans out of Europe, and most of them ended up in the US, and the leading physicists in the United States in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were all European emigres or their students. But in medicine and public health, we didn't want anything to do with these people. We had fought a war against them. We didn't want to read their literature. I actually document this in Good Calories, Bad Calories. So it's like if you imagine in physics, the physicists saying post-war, we don't care what Einstein had to say, or Bohr, or that Nazi, Heisenberg, or Maxwell, we don't care about any of those people because we didn't like them. And we're going to recreate physics from scratch. But we didn't do that because we needed those people, if nothing else, to build bombs and fight a Cold War, and so we embraced them. In medicine and public health, we did not, okay? So everything I'm about to tell you vanished with the war. I mean, it's an amazing story to me when I learned this because I had no idea when I started my research. So the first thing they would say is, look, we know that obesity has a large genetic component. It's about 60 or 70% is determined by genes. This was first demonstrated in the early 1930s. And so you could look at these two pairs of identical twins. On the left, you've got a lean pair, and on the right, you've got an obese pair. And our overeating obesity hypothesis might tell you why the obese pair is heavier than the lean pair. They took in more calories than they expended. But why does the obese pair have the exact same body? And the lean pair have the exact same body? And we know that body types are, families often have the same body types. Identical twins don't just look alike. Not just their faces, their bodies look alike. So what is controlling where the fat goes on these women? That they have the identical bodies. Our calorie theory, our overeating theory says nothing about that. You can look at animal husbandry as an example. Okay, we've been breeding animals for a couple, 1,000 years probably to have whatever characteristics we think we can breed into them. So on the left, you have a Jersey cow. Okay, this is a dairy cow. You can see the swollen udder. And on the right, you have an Aberdeen Angus, which is a meat cow, meat cattle, stocky, beefy. You've got you can see in the inset the fatty, beef that you get from these cows. And you could just ask the question, why is it? We know this is genetic because these are two different breeds, right? So why is the Jersey cow lean and the Aberdeen Angus, stocky, beefy, fatty, and muscular? And it's hard to explain it from our calories idea, that the genes that determine this determine how much these animals eat or exercise. Maybe they determine that the Jersey takes smaller bites than the Aberdeen Angus, or it only grazes 8 hours a day, or maybe it's genetically driven to go out for a jog late at night, like the Far Side cartoon, and then the Aberdeen Angus wanders into the bar and watches TV. Here's another idea. Okay, there's a technical term called fuel partitioning, how we partition the fuel that we consume. So if you think about, again, all ethical considerations put aside for a second, we want the Jersey to take in fuel on one side and turn it into milk. And we don't want it wasting a lot of fuel, bulking up in here. We want this process to be as efficient as possible. And generating milk is an energy-expensive process. So we want all that fuel to go to just doing that. And in the Aberdeen Angus, we want that fuel to go into building up protein and fat stores. So we want it partitioned differently, and maybe that's what the genes do. They determine not how much these animals eat and exercise, but how they use the food they do eat and exercise, they do take in, how they partition it. So here's another example. You know, sexual variations, men and women fatten differently. Men get fat, Lance mentioned this, men get fat above the waist, women tend to get fat below the waist. If you get fat, both these people would have, in our theory, overeating theory, taken in more energy than expended, but in the man, it went one place, in the woman, it went the other place. In the man, it doubled his risk of heart disease, and in the woman, it didn't. And there are men who put on fat below the waist, in which their risk of heart disease is not doubled. So what do the calories have to do with it? That's what I want you to think about it. What do the calories have to do with where the fat goes and why it might increase risk of heart disease? Puberty, another example straight from these pre-World War II textbooks. Boys and girls enter puberty with roughly the same amount of body fat. Okay? As they get older and they go through puberty, the boys gain muscle and lose fat, and the girls gain fat in very specific places. Okay? Hips, breasts, buttocks. They both take in more calories than they expend because they're both getting bigger. But the boys lose fat and gain muscle, and the girls gain fat in specific places. When they get out of puberty, they have about 50% less fat, more fat than the boys. What do the calories have to do with it? Okay, we know why they get taller. They get taller because they're secreting growth hormone. We know why the boys put on muscle because they're secreting male sex hormones. And we know why the girls put on fat, and they put on fat in specific places because of the female sex hormones. The fact that they take in more energy than they expend is irrelevant. Lipodystrophies, last one. By the time I got to this in my book, my editor was saying, Gary, your book is beginning to look like a circus freak show. Rein it in. Last one. This is a disorder. Lipodystrophy means a disorder of fat accumulation. And this particular one was known as progressive lipodystrophy. There were about 200-odd cases on record by the 1950s, about 80% of them in women. In these cases, the women start losing all subcutaneous fat in their forehead, and it moves down, it progresses down, hence the term progressive lipodystrophy. And then it often stops just above the hips at the waist, and then you'll see in some cases the creation of lower body obesity, what they call localized obesity. So this woman had a BMI of 34, but she had no body fat above the waist, all her body fat's below the waist. And the way these Europeans said, are we going to blame the top half on undereating and the bottom half on overeating? Because that's what our energy balance theory tells us to do. And if we can't blame localized obesity on undereating, this is what's called a thought experiment or a Gedanken experiment, because it has the old German term. If we can't blame localized obesity, in this case, on overeating, how can we blame global obesity, any obesity, on overeating? And if this woman had, say, 5 pounds more fat on her upper body just to disguise the obvious lipodystrophy, she'd go into the doctor, and the doctor would say, look, you got a BMI of 35, you're obese, we want you to eat less and exercise more. Okay, it's just because we could see the lipodystrophy that we can say, look, this is a crazy explanation. There has to be something else going on. So why do we believe this obesity, this energy in, energy out things, calories in, calories out? And the answer is the first law of thermodynamics, okay? Whenever anyone makes an argument like I've made for the past 50 or 60 years, we're accused of not believing the laws of thermodynamics apply to humans. Okay, I was on the Larry King show. And Jillian Michaels, a trainer from The Biggest Loser, came on from Los Angeles. We were in New York, and gave me a lecture on national television on the laws of thermodynamics. And I went to Harvard, and I studied physics. I was a lousy student. I was a B- student, I admit. I had other things on my mind. And even if I didn't, I might have been a lousy student at physics. I was speechless. You could watch this clip on YouTube. I literally was speechless. I had no idea what to say to this. Here's the thing. The laws of thermodynamics, energy conservation, the first law of thermodynamics, it's the easiest one to explain. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So if a system gets bigger, if it gets more energetic, it's got to take in more energy than it expends, because you can't just create energy in the middle of the system. It's got to get in there. That's all it's saying. And if a system gets smaller, the energy has to leave. So it's got to take out more energy than it takes in. And the way so this is called the energy balance equation up here. Delta E equals E in minus E out. So delta E is a change in energy in a system is equal to the energy in minus the energy out. And if we think about how that relates to our weight, it's a change in our fat mass is equal to the energy consumed minus the energy expended, okay? So this has to be true. Okay, this has to be true. The law, again, I have a physics degree. The laws of thermodynamics are called laws because they're always true. It's not the theory of thermodynamics, it's the law of thermodynamics. Here's the problem, okay? What this theory says, again, is if a system gets bigger, if delta E goes up, more energy has to go into the system than leaves. And if the delta E goes down, more energy has to leave than go in. Okay, but it doesn't say anything about why any of these happen, about causality. Okay, there's no arrow of causality here. It just describes two things that have to happen at the same time for the world to work the way we know it to work. Okay, so to give you an example, let's say instead of wondering why I have so much fat trapped in like my fat tissue in the form of energy, so much energy in the form of fat, I want to know why there's so much energy in this room in the form of people. So we're walking by and we see this crowded room and you say to me, Gary, why is that room so full of energy? It's like saying, why is that person so full of their fat tissue so full of energy? And I say, because more people entered than left. Okay, which is the equivalent of saying the person got fat because more energy went in than went out. The question is, did I tell you anything you didn't know? Did I say anything meaningful if I tell you more people, it's crowded because more people entered than left? And you think, Gary, of course more people entered than left. It's crowded. That's why I asked the question. But why is it crowded? And now I say, look, if more people enter than leave, it's got to become crowded, right? And now I'm saying the equivalent of if you take in more energy than you expend, you have to become fat. And I still haven't told you anything meaningful. And by now you'd probably be ready to slap me because you'd think this guy's a real smart ass. Why didn't he tell me why the room's crowded? But there's a lot of reason why the room could be crowded. There could be free drinks in here. It could be lunchtime, and this is where lunch is served. It could be the sprinkler system went on in the hotel, and this was the only room that was dry. You know, it could be that huge doormen standing at the door pulling in everyone who walks by and not letting them leave. Maybe this is the only room with air conditioning, you know? Maybe it's freezing outside and this is the only room with heat. So there are a lot of reasons why the room might be crowded. They have to do with the conditions in the room, the conditions outside the room, and the conditions at the barrier, the doormen, the bodybuilders, you know? The fact that more people entered than left doesn't tell you anything. It's meaningless. So one of the things I've tried to get across is like this: more people, taking more energy than you expending, overeating, same thing, is a meaningless concept. If someone got fatter, they overate while they got fatter, okay? They had to, but it tells you nothing about why they got fatter or why they overate. It just says that this has to happen. And, there's an alternative hypothesis here, okay? This is, I've hoped that I've at least shaken some of your belief in the verities, okay, in the dogma. Now let me try and replace it, again, with the way the pre-World War II Europeans thought about this. So for starters, instead of saying obesity is a disorder of energy balance, they said obesity is a sort of excess fat accumulation. It's like the simplest possible thing you could say about this statement. Having too much fat is a disorder of having too much fat. And you could think that's so simple, it's meaningless. But if you just phrase it like that, the first thing you might want to know is, I wonder what regulates fat accumulation in the human body, because this person's got too much of it. If you say obesity is a disorder of energy balance or overeating, what you want to know is what regulates appetite and what regulates physical activity, which are two different things. What you really want to know is what regulates the accumulation of fat and fat cells. And this is a good rule in all of science. Always begin your investigation with the simplest statement of the problem that doesn't include any assumptions, okay? Because the assumptions might be wrong. So the simplest thing you could say about obesity, overweight, is that the person has too much fat. I wonder why. If somebody walked in here who was 8 feet tall, and we would think this guy's got a height disorder, we wouldn't care how many calories he consumed or expended, even though he could weigh 500 pounds. We'd wonder what regulates his height. And if we were doctors, we'd throw him in an MRI to find the tumor in his pituitary gland that we knew would have to be there to make him grow this tall. And if somebody walked in who was an adult, fully formed, 4 feet tall or 3.5 feet tall, we'd wonder what of the various growth hormone or growth hormone receptor defects this person is suffering from so that they didn't grow to full height. What you want to know is what regulates fat accumulation. And in this hypothesis, overeating and inactivity are compensatory effects, they're not causes, okay? And I'll explain that shortly. So we don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because our fat tissue is accumulating excess fat. This is how it was told to me. This is how the pre-World War II Europeans told it to me, and some very bright people who study animals today described it to me. So this is our conventional wisdom. First law of thermodynamics, E in and E out, energy in and expenditure change, and that causes you to store too much fat or to lose weight. The alternative hypothesis, this delta E, this energy expend, this fat mass, lives in this hormonal milieu, this world of hormones and enzymes that are very, that evolved over 2 million years or more to carefully control the amount of fat on your body. And if that milieu changes, it could stimulate growth of fat tissue. And if fat tissue goes up, if you get heavier, we know you have to take in more energy than you expend, so that in turn causes a compensatory change in appetite or expenditure. Okay? Here's an example, analogy. I'm going to go back to the growing child. I'm going to use a photo of this extraordinary cute kid. He used to live in New York. When he was 1 year old, and he's cute, he weighed 20 pounds. And when he was 4 years old in 2009, 3 years later, he weighed 45 pounds. Okay? He presently weighs about 62 pounds. In this period, he got bigger, he got heavier, he took in more calories than he expended. He overate, right? But he didn't grow because he overate. He overate because he was growing. He overate because he was growing. Intake and expenditure, appetite and energy expenditure are determined by growth, not the other way around. So if you think about it, again, remember back to your own children. When they went through growth spurts, they ate voraciously. They were eating me out of house and home, especially when they go through puberty. And they lie around the couch all day long. They exhibit gluttony and sloth. But that's not why they're growing, okay? They're growing because they're secreting growth hormone and sex hormones, and these things are playing havoc with their body and making them change in all kinds of ways. And the gluttony and sloth is a side effect of this drive to grow, the body's need to fuel the growth and create these new structures, new tissues, new bigger organs. So growth is the cause, or the hormonal drivers of growth is the cause, is always the cause. And intake and expenditure are the compensatory effects. Here's another example, cancer. You can see in these photos there's a tumor growing. This tumor is getting bigger. It's taking in more energy than we expend, than it expends. We can starve it, it's true, and suppress its growth. It's hard to do, but you can do it. But that doesn't mean it's growing because it's taking in more energy than it expends. It's taking in more energy than it expends because it's growing, and it's growing because it's got all these genes that are broken, oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes that drive it to unfettered growth and drive it to multiply and produce daughter cells. And as it grows, it's got to take in fuel to do it. And in fact, it'll upregulate things like insulin receptors so that it can suck in more glucose. Growth is the cause. Overeating, gluttony and sloth is the effect. So this was known as the lipophilia theory of obesity. Okay, it was a pre-World War II German-Austrian hypothesis. The leading proponents, it was created by this fellow Gustav von Bergmann, who was a leading German authority in internal medicine pre-World War II, one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious prizes of the Society of Internal Medicine in Germany today is the Gustav von Bergmann Award. And then it was taken up by Julius Bauer in the 1920s. Bauer was a leading expert at the University of Vienna on the relationship between genetics and chronic disease. He was an endocrinologist, a hormone specialist. He's still famous today in Austria. These people were not quacks. Okay? It was more or less fully accepted in Europe by 1940, which was a very bad year for Europe. And as I explained, the war came in and this theory evaporated. Here's how Bauer put it, though, in 1929. Here's how they thought about it. He said, like a malignant tumor like the fetus, the uterus or the breasts of a pregnant woman, the abnormal lipophilic tissue seizes on foodstuffs, even in the case of undernutrition. Okay, so we can, just from that sentence, we can begin to understand the populations that I discussed earlier with starving children and obese mothers. Okay, even in the case of undernutrition, the fat tissue can get fatter and stay fat. It maintains its stock and may increase it independent of the requirements of the organism. Sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself and does not fit into the precisely regulated management of the whole organism. So lipophilia means love of fat. And the way they thought about it, a lot of this came, Bergman pointed out in one of his first papers, there was a case in the late 19th century of a young girl got a bad burn on the back of her hand. And when she turned 30, well, they took skin from her stomach to graft onto the back of her hand. And when by the time she was in her 30s, she was obese. She had this huge puff of fat on her hand where they had grafted the skin. And it was fascinating. It means there's something in the skin itself that has this tendency, this characteristic that they call lipophilia, that makes it want to fill with fat. So they said, look, it's fascinating. We get fat in some places and not others, just like we grow hair in some places and not others. So we don't get fat on our foreheads or the back of our hands, but we do get fat in our guts or our hips. We all know where we get fat. And just like some people are hairier than others, some people are fatter than others. And this is all determined by hormones and enzymes in the central nervous system and all these regulatory factors. And they thought if we ever figure out what regulates fat accumulation, we'll understand why people get fat and why they get fatter than other people and why they put on fat in some places and not others. They didn't know it when the war came. After the war, a lot of people did animal models of it. There's a couple hundred models of obesity. Animal models of obesity. There's a whole host of different ways you can make animals obese. You could just ask the question, when you have an obese animal, is the intervention that made it obese, whether it's genetic or surgical or even dietary, did it make them eat too much? Or did it just make their fat tissue more lipophilic, want to fill up with fat? Because we know if we make the animal heavier, that in turn will make them want to eat more. And John NAIA was a leading nutritionist in the US in the 50s through the 70s. He did some very good things. He also did some very bad things. He studied a strain of obese mice, and this is how he put it in 1968. He said, these mice will make fat out of their food under the most unlikely circumstances, even when half starved. So they don't get fat because they overeat. They get fat if they eat at all. Okay, again, he's saying the very same thing that Bauer was saying in 1929 about the cause of obesity. The problem is, NAIA was a Frenchman who fought in the French resistance. And one of his colleagues told me when I interviewed him, he said, yeah, NAIA hated the Germans. He killed quite a few of them. And he just wouldn't quote the German literature, and there's no sign that he ever read the German literature. So he got this close to reinventing the German theories, but he couldn't do it because he believed that obesity was about energy balance. But if obesity is sort of excess fat accumulation, again, you just ask the question, what regulates fat accumulation? And this is something that researchers are taught in medical school, doctors are taught in medical school, but they're actually taught that it's not relevant to obesity, which is fascinating. And what I'm arguing it is, and it's very simple, it's going to get a little technical here, 5 minutes of biology. So all you have to know, this is Adiposity 101, okay? Fat, we store fat. It's found in the blood in several forms. The key ones for us are triglycerides, and this is a diagram of a triglyceride here. So there's a fatty acid, which is that long stream on top, that long molecule, and then 3 of them bond together with a glycerol molecule, and you end up with this thing called a triglyceride. Okay, so we store fat as triglycerides, and we burn them as fatty acids. Okay, and fat enters and exits the fat cells as fatty acids. And inside the fat cell, there's this triglyceride fatty acid cycle that I'm going to show you in a second, where fatty acids continually cycle in triglycerides and back out again. Okay, so here's what it looks like. And this is where it gets complicated because I love to have a laser pointer and I don't. Here's your fat cell membrane, and outside is the bloodstream, and inside is the fat cell. Okay, so fats move through the bloodstream as triglycerides and lipoproteins, the same things, LDL, the bad cholesterol, it also carries triglycerides. It's not bad cholesterol, as Lance will tell you, but it's a useful cliche at the moment. So there's an enzyme on the membrane called lipoprotein lipase, which reaches out into the bloodstream, breaks the triglycerides and this lipoprotein down into its component fatty acids, and then the fatty acids can flow through the cell membranes. This is why we transport our fat as fatty acids, because they're small enough to fit through the cell membrane. And then once they're in the cell, they're esterified. The glycerol attaches to 3 fatty acids. You end up as a triglyceride. And it's really cool. The reason we store fat as triglycerides is because the triglycerides are too big to get out of the fat cell, to get through the membrane. It's like if you've ever bought a piece of furniture and you took it home and you found out it was too big to get into the room, to get through the door that you wanted to, so hopefully you bought it at IKEA and you could take it apart. And then you put the parts through, which are the fatty acids and the glycerol, and then you rebuild it in the fat cell in the room, and then you hope that you're never going to move, okay, because it's in that room forever. Well, that's what we do. I mean, and one of the things when I was writing my book, it was hard not to get angry, because this was worked out by some brilliant scientists from the 1920s to the 1960s, and it's considered irrelevant to why you get fat. So think about it. Why your fat cell accumulates fat is considered irrelevant to why you get fatter as a human being. But if somebody tells you that you got fatter because you took in more energy than they expend, they don't care about this, and this is beautiful science. So getting back to inside the fat cell, the triglycerides are also broken down by enzymes in the fat cell into fatty acids. Some of the fatty acids will escape from the fat cell because they can get through the membrane. Some will be what's called re-esterified into triglycerides. And here's where the energy balance thing comes in handy. If more fat enters your fat cell than leaves it, your fat cell gets fatter. So do you, because it's your fat cell. More fat leaves the fat cell than enters it, that fat cell gets leaner, and so do you, because it's your fat cell. Okay, you're just a combination of all your fat cells. Okay? So anything that works to increase the flow of fatty acids into the fat cell, anything that works to esterify the fatty acids into triglycerides, anything that works to suppress the breakdown of triglycerides into free fatty acids, suppress the flow of fatty acids out of the fat cell, works to make you fatter, and vice versa. And so you could just ask the question, what controls that? Because this was worked out beginning in 1959 when the technology was created to allow us to measure hormones in the blood. And here's the answer, okay? Insulin, the hormone insulin, the same one that's out of whack in diabetes. So we think of it as a hormone that puts blood sugar into muscle cells, but insulin is also the principal regulator of fat metabolism. That was discovered by the early 60s by Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson, who developed this technology to measure hormones in the bloodstream. Yalow won the Nobel Prize for it in 1977. Burson had passed away by then. And this diagram right here is from a 2010 textbook. So I just wanted to show you, this didn't go away. But it's the regulation, hormonal regulation of fat tissue. So you got fat storage on the left, fat mobilization on the right. And you can see it's insulin, 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 insulin. And then there's a few other hormones that work a little bit to get fat, to mobilize fat from fat cells. Actually, all other hormones do for the most part. Because hormones tell your body to do something. And in the process of telling your body to do something, they make the fuel available to do it, so they try to get some fat out of your fat cells so that you can burn that fat if you need it. Insulin is the primary hormone that puts it in there. Here's the suppression of fat mobilization, the suppression, stopping fat from escaping. And again, it's insulin, 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 insulin. As Yalow and Burson put it, the release of fatty acids from fat cells requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. Okay? If you want to get fat out of your fat tissue, you don't care about eating less or exercising more. You want to get the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. You want to lower your insulin levels. Okay, here's just an example of insulin as a fat storage hormone. It's from a 2001 textbook. This is a young woman who at age 17 was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. For the next half century, she gave herself her insulin injections on the same 2 spots on her thighs, and she ended up with these huge fat masses on her thighs. And this is in the textbook as the example. It says the overall action of insulin on the adipocyte, that's the fat cell, is to stimulate fat storage and inhibit mobilization. And the remarkable effects of locally injected insulin on the accumulation of triglyceride, that's fat, into fat cells are graphically illustrated here. So here's the key points of Adiposity 101, fat cell regulation. When insulin is secreted or chronically elevated, your fat accumulates in the fat cells. When insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissue and the fat depots shrink. And we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet. Okay, for all intents and purposes, they regulate our insulin levels. George Cahill was a Harvard diabetes specialist. He was the science director of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute for 20 years. He did some of this research in the 1950s. He co-edited a textbook, an American Physiological Society textbook on this science in 1965. He passed away recently, and the way the way he said it to me, he said, carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat, okay? This is a completely conventional wisdom thought. The problem is, if you remove his driving insulin from that sentence, those 3 words, you're left with carbohydrate is driving fat, okay? And now what you have is the Atkins diet. And now you've gone to quackery, okay? As this science developed in the 1960s, physicians who were struggling with their own weight and their own obese, overweight patients read the research literature and said, hey, if insulin drives fat accumulation and carbohydrates drive insulin, what happens if we remove the carbohydrates from the diet and replace it with fat, which is the one nutrient that does not stimulate insulin secretion? So that way, obese people don't have to eat less. They don't have to exercise more. They just lower their insulin. The way you do that is get the carbs out and add the fat back in. And now you're eating lobster Newburg and double quarter pounders with cheese and no buns and all these horrible fattening foods that they thought would kill you. As Lance showed you, they were wrong. But we had this sort of cognitive dissonance growing where the biology of fat tissue said, this is the diet you should be eating if you want to remain lean or get lean. And we had the cardiologists and nutritionists saying, no, we got to eat the opposite diet because we want to avoid heart disease. And then 40 to 50 years later, we have epidemics of obesity and diabetes in coincidence with the shift of the carbohydrate from this being the sort of fattening carbohydrate, which was how it was believed in the 1960s, to a heart-healthy diet food, so that when you go out there, what you have is carbs, 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 and carbs for your snacks. But they're low-fat, right, so they're heart-healthy. So the interesting thing is, you can just ask the question like, where is this science? I must be making this up, right? It can't be that simple. And what's fascinating is it's in the textbooks. Okay, so here's Leninger's Principles of Biochemistry. It's the most well-respected biochemistry textbook. This is I think it's a 2010 edition. It's the latest edition. If you go to the index and you look up adipocyte, which is a technical term for fat cell, in the index, and you go to where it shows you, and it will give you this sentence under if you want to know what makes a fat cell fat, it will say high blood glucose, which you get from eating a carb-rich meal or being diabetic, elicits the release of insulin, which speeds the uptake of glucose by tissues and favors the storage of fuels as glycogen, which is the storage form of carbohydrates, and triglycerides, which is fat, while inhibiting fatty acid mobilization in adipose tissues. So what makes a fat cell fat? High blood sugar from a carb-rich meal stimulating insulin secretion. What makes people fat? This is a different chapter. To a first approximation, obesity is a result of taking in more calories in the diet than are expended by the body's energy consuming. These people were locked in a paradigm. Okay, I actually had an interview with this. I showed you these pictures from the 2010 textbook with insulin. I interviewed that guy a few years ago, Keith Frayne, probably the world's leading authority on fat metabolism, University of Oxford, and we were talking about a condition called insulin resistance, and he was explaining for 20 minutes what makes a fat cell fat. And then we got to people, and he said, they overeat. And I said, wait, Keith, you just switched your mechanism on me. When you were talking about a fat cell, you were talking about insulin, hormonal regulation, the fat cell, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then you got the people, and you got this overeating thing. What happened? And he goes, I never thought of that. He retired last year. And he didn't. None of us did. Never crossed my mind until I started doing this research and realized that the pre-World War II Europeans were better at this than we were. Anyway, so here's the alternative hypothesis. Pretty simple. Like any growth defect, obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder. Okay? It's got nothing to do with overeating and sedentary behavior, except that it kind of associates with it. Like type 2 diabetes, it is fundamentally a disorder of insulin signaling, okay? Hence, obesity and type 2 diabetes are so intimately connected that people now refer to it often as diabesity, as like the same disease, And they probably are the same disease. They're two sides to the same disease coin. And it is triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. Okay, not any carbs, not the green leafy vegetables which have carbs in, because it's about how quickly you digest these carbohydrates and about where these carbohydrates are metabolized. So there's a term, high glycemic index carbs. They're digested quickly. That's the base of the food guide pyramid, okay? Bread, cereal, rice, pasta, 6 to 11 servings a day. These foods are fattening, okay? We're told to eat them all the time. You just had them for probably breakfast and lunch. The idea is they are literally fattening. And then sweets up at top. Sugar and high fructose corn syrup are both roughly 50-50 mixes of the carbohydrate glucose and the carbohydrate fructose. Unlike starch, which breaks down to glucose alone, fructose is metabolized mostly in your liver. And there's evidence, good evidence, since the 1960s building today that fructose causes what's called insulin resistance. Once you're insulin resistant, it means you have to secrete more insulin to do the same job because your cells are resistant to it. And as you secrete more insulin, you store more fat. So one of the arguments I've made recently that I believe the data represent is that sugars are the fundamental problem. Once they enter a population, they start to cause insulin resistance, and then all the other carbs become problematic. So this is our alternative hypothesis. Refined grains, starches, and sugar drive insulin secretion, and that drives excess fat accumulation, obesity, and the obesity epidemic. And you could ask the question, should this be surprising? I'm wrapping up. I have no idea how long I've been talking. I apologize. One of my favorite sentences, I use this in both books. First sentence of a 1963 British Journal of Nutrition article written by one of the two leading British dietitians. Every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. And what's fascinating is there's a British report in the early 1980s once they decided that dietary fat causes heart disease incorrectly, as Lance explained. And they want everybody to eat carbs. And the report actually says we have to figure out how to get people to eat more carbohydrates after we've been telling them for the past 50 years they were fattening. Okay, the point is every woman did believe this in the early 1960s. My mother's generation believed it. You know, there were certain foods that were fattening. They happened to be bread, cereal, rice, pasta, sweets, etc., the base of the food guide pyramid. If you didn't want to be fat, you didn't eat them. You know, I lived in Paris for 2 years. I was lucky. Mid-1980s, no self-respecting French woman over the age of about 23 would eat bread if she didn't want to be fat. It was that simple. You'd see the baguette thing, you know, but they weren't eating the baguettes. Their daughters were eating the baguettes, and maybe the older women were eating the baguettes because it's all they could afford. If you wanted to remain lean, you didn't eat the baguette. Okay, diet for obesity. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, I found 4 diets for obesity published in the medical journals. Harvard University, Harvard Med School, Stanford Med School, Cornell Medical School, pretty good medical schools, University of Chicago, and this one from the Practice of Endocrinology, which is a leading British textbook. Endocrinology is the science of hormones. Raymond Greene was a leading British endocrinologist of the mid-20th century. He was the brother of Graham Greene, the novelist. And they were all this diet. I use this one because they phrased it the best. Foods to be avoided. Bread and everything else made with flour, cereals, potatoes, all their white root vegetables, foods containing much sugar, all sweets. You can eat as much as you like of the following: meat, fish, birds, all green vegetables, eggs, dried or fresh, cheese, fruit except bananas and grapes. This is the Atkins diet. Okay, 20 years before Atkins, no, except for the fruit. Atkins didn't like fruit either, neither do I that much if you're overweight or obese. What's fascinating is this is before they understood the role of insulin. Greene had some wonderful statements once they started to understand it about how confusing it was for doctors. But the idea is you avoid the foods on the left because they're literally fattening. Just like cigarettes literally cause lung cancer, these foods literally make you fat. If you don't want to be fat, you don't eat them. If you get rid of them and you lose 30 pounds and you go back to eating them, they're still fattening. That being fattening doesn't go away. And you get fatter again. And you can eat as much as you like of the following foods because they're not fattening. They don't stimulate insulin the way the other foods do, so they don't have this effect of making your body accumulate fat. So, and just in terms of health factors, you know, like I said, one of the reasons this got thrown out in the 1970s, I described this in Good Calories, Bad Calories, got thrown out because we started to believe that diet heart disease. They were well-meaning, but misguided. And they also didn't like Atkins. They all knew him. And they literally didn't like him. I mean, they just thought he was a jerk who was out to make money. So in order to get rid of Atkins, they had to get rid of the science. Like Atkins was the bathwater, and the whole hormonal regulation of fat tissue was the baby. And they got rid of both of them. So by the 1980s, we didn't care what regulated fat accumulation in fat cells. Now we care. We're getting there. So the question is, what happens when you go on one of these diets? Because they're supposed to kill you. They're supposed to clog your arteries. The American Heart Association in 1973 had a critical review describing how these things would kill you because they didn't want anyone eating them. So here's a summary from 2012. Systematic review, meta-analysis carried out to study the effects of low-carbohydrate diet on weight loss, cardiovascular risk factors. Total of 23 reports corresponding to 17 clinical investigations were identified as meeting pre-specified criteria. Meta-analysis carried out on 1,141 patients showed the low-carbohydrate diet to be associated with, now these are experiments, not observations, decreases in body weight, body mass index, abdominal circumference, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, plasma triglycerides, fasting glucose, glycated hemoglobin, plasma insulin, plasma C-reactive protein, that's inflammation, as well as an increase in high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, the good cholesterol that you want to increase. And then they say, however, the effects on long-term health are unknown. So everything, you go on one of these diets, everything improves. Remember I said I could give this talk about heart disease, diabetes, all signs of heart, all risk factors for heart disease, diabetes, arguably cancer, they all get better. But we don't know what's going to happen for the long term. You know, if you stay on it, it might kill you quick or somewhere, that's the belief, because there's cognitive dissonance. We believe dietary fat and saturated fat are bad for so long that we just can't believe that when we do experiments, we see what we really see. Everything improves. Anyway, we can go on. Conclusions. Obesity is sort of fat accumulation, okay? That's undeniable, right? I mean, that's just stating the obvious. Fat accumulation is regulated fundamentally by insulin and dietary carbohydrates. That's in the textbooks, okay? And the solution to obesity and the obesity epidemics is not getting people to move more and eating less, but restricting the causative agents. If you don't want your patient, if you're a doctor, you don't want your patient to get lung cancer, you tell them to quit smoking. Okay? You don't tell them to eat less and exercise more. You tell them to quit smoking. Here, you got to tell them that the answer is you don't eat the refined grains and sugars. They literally make people fat. I have time for one more slide, maybe. I probably don't. But we asked this question earlier. Why were those populations fat? You know, these poor, hard-working populations. This is what Ralph Richards said in 1973. He said, most third world countries have a high carbohydrate intake as their economic dependence is predominantly agricultural with a heavy dependence on non-dairy produces. It is conceivable that the ready availability of starch in preference to animal protein, contributing as it must to the main caloric requirements of these populations, leads to increased lipogenesis, that's fat formation, and the development of obesity. I think there's a lot. I think Richards was right. And it's one of the great tragedies of modern medicine. And the question is, you know, how do we change it? And one of the ways I do it is to give lectures like this. So I want to thank you for your patience. I'm open to answering any questions until I'm told that we just have to get out. I have to get off the stage. My one constraint is I'm a little bit to moderately deaf, okay? And I am torturing my children by making them have to repeat everything 5 times. And I'm too macho, I don't know what it is, I just can't do the hearing aid thing yet. So when you ask questions without a microphone, please speak up.
Could you back up one slide? I missed the last entry. Thank you.
Oh, okay. That was easy.
So the French paradox, which, you know, high fatty foods, but they blame it, or they attribute the positives to, you know, red wine and chocolate.
Right.
Is there any insight?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 things. The fascinating thing, the history of sugar is fascinating. By the way, one of the things, like I said, I think sugar is a fundamental trigger for heart disease, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, possibly cancer as well, quackish as it may sound. The French were traditionally, it's interesting, in the history of sugar, those countries that were tea drinkers, the tea was basically a vehicle to put sugar in. In fact, the British started their sugar industry in the Caribbean about the same time they started their tea industry in Southeast Asia, because it was an excuse just to load this awful tasting tea stuff up with sugar. Coffee drinking countries didn't go that far. So the French were coffee drinkers and wine drinkers, so they had traditionally about half the sugar consumption we had. The numbers are hard to equate these days because they jump around depending on how people like to define them. But in general, they had about half the sugar. And I think that right there is the French paradox. A typical question also asked, I just said, look, you know, people with high carb, countries with high carb intakes get fat. But then what about Southeast Asians, which is another way to ask this question. Southeast Asians are also countries with traditionally extremely low sugar intakes. So if you look at the data from the early 1960s, for instance, the Japanese were eating about 40 pounds per capita, again, in one particular measure of sugar consumption. And that was equivalent to how much we were eating in around the 1840s. And there's very little evidence that we had obesity or diabetes at any prevalence at all in the 1840s either. So it's like this idea that sugar is a trigger. It's based on both the biology and then these observations. So the French, the Greek islanders, the Mediterranean islanders whose diet is so famous, extremely little sugar intake, and virtually no liquid sugars until recently. Yes?
What is your feeling about artificial sweeteners? Because I understand some of them are supposed to trigger insulin release also.
Okay, so the question is artificial sweeteners. I think they're better than sugar. You know, it's like you're jumping out of an airplane, a parachute is better than no parachute. So I think the artificial sweeteners are the parachute. The best thing is you don't jump out of the airplane. So in an ideal world, you give up sweets, you get over your sweet tooth, it's difficult to do. Evidence suggests it takes about 3 weeks to a month and you fight it for the rest of your life. But in an ideal world, you don't eat any sugar. My problem with artificial sweeteners is not that I think they cause any chronic diseases, although some people obviously seem to be intolerant of aspartame, and I may be one of them now. But if you're obese or overweight and you're being told, I got to give up sweets, it's like you're being told if you're a smoker to give up cigarettes. And the fear is that if you continue to use artificial sweeteners, A, your body may still recognize them as sugar, and this is an open question. So it may still stimulate insulin secretion, weirdly enough, because your body doesn't know the difference. But more than that, it keeps your sweet tooth alive. So it's kind of like I quit smoking 12 years ago. I chewed Nicorettes up until March of 2012, and I'm still in danger of backsliding to cigarettes because I still have a nicotine craving. Had I just gone cold turkey 12 years ago, I probably would have quit, hence the parachute. But if I could have done it, I wouldn't worry that I might go back to smoking someday.
How about honey, agave nectar, maple syrup, alternatives to sugars, to white sugar?
So honey, agave nectar, maple syrup, again, it's a difficult issue. The idea is it's the fructose component of the sugar in the high fructose corn syrup that causes a problem, but we only get it along with glucose. So sugar is a molecule of glucose bonded to a molecule of fructose. High fructose corn syrup are fructose molecules floating around with an almost equal amount of glucose molecules. So the idea is the fructose causes havoc when it's consumed quickly in your liver, and the glucose is stimulating insulin secretion. So when you get to agave nectar, that can be 75–90% fructose. So that could be much worse. Because you got that much more fructose. It could be not as bad or just as bad because you don't have as much glucose to stimulate insulin secretion while you're getting the fructose. And without doing very good studies, randomized controlled trials, there's no way I couldn't guess which way that effect would go. My gut feeling is it's probably a little worse.
What about
honey? Honey is fascinating. Honey also has about 50% or more fructose, but it's viscous, thick. So I think, if you look historically, we've always consumed about 1 pound of honey per capita. In the 1900s, when the soft drink industry was just burgeoning, and today it's about the same. And my feeling is you just can't use honey the way you can use. So I don't know if you could get someone to eat like 50 pounds of honey a year And 50 pounds of sugar, yeah, exactly. It's like you can't imagine it. You can't put it in cold drinks because it coagulates. And for whatever reason, like you could use it in tea, which people use, and you could use it in baking. But imagine putting it in coffee. I mean, I don't know why. It's a hot thing. Just like tea, it should work, but you can't imagine. So the idea is just by its form it comes in, it's inherently restricted. And if you could turn it into a form that could be used as easily as sugar and high fructose corn syrup, it might be as bad or worse, I don't know, but we don't have it in that form, so it isn't. Same with maple syrup. Yes.
What about stevia?
Stevia, I think, is like probably the healthiest of the artificial sweeteners. If you just go, and the people I respect in this business think so, it's because it's natural in its own way. And then there are these sort of molecular subproducts of it, like Reb A, that don't have the bitter taste that some people notice in stevia. But it's been around for hundreds of years, been used as a sweetener in Central America by Central American Indians. So, you know, it just seems more natural.
I don't mean to make light of the red wine thing, but I am a person that I live with a lot of stress, and red wine helps a lot. If I have to give up red wine, can I drink vodka?
Try the bourbon.
You know, it's about living well as living long. So it's sort of, you know, we want to live the healthiest possible diet, but it can be really boring. I mean, you know, so I'm all, and look, if the French do it, obviously it works for the French. So they drink a lot of red wine. I mean, every once in a while when I'm passing a bakery and I smell the croissants, I think they probably put so much butter in it, and if they make it right, that it mitigates the harm from the carbs, I'm going to treat myself to a croissant. So I'm all for red wine. It's better than white because it's got less sugar. And one of the things I do eat like this now, one of the problems that I find is that I can't drink champagne anymore. It's like I get a hangover 7 seconds after I've had my first sip. And could be the sugar content.